The girl and her younger brother were returning home from school when their entire family mysteriously disappeared. The police, starting the investigation, had no idea they were about to face the most mysterious and shocking case in their practice. Sarah Maynard was born on April 1, 1997, in the small American town of Mount Vernon, Ohio. 2 years later, her parents had a son, Cody. Shortly after that, the couple divorced, but the father continued to see the children regularly, and for a time they lived together. When the father remarried, he had another child, and the family moved to another state. Sarah's mother, Tina, began dating a man named Greg, and they moved to a private house in the suburbs of Mount Vernon. It was a quiet residential area by a large picturesque lake. By 2010, when Sarah turned 13, her father had returned to the town, allowing him to see the children again. At this time, Tina started looking for an apartment closer to her work, with the help of her friend and neighbor, Stephanie. Tina worked at a restaurant on the outskirts of Mount Vernon and was supposed to start her evening shift on November 10, 2010. But she never showed up at work, which concerned her manager, who knew her as a responsible employee. The manager called the police to check Tina's house. The officers arrived at the scene, found no signs of anyone being there, and left. The next day, Tina didn't show up for work again. The manager tried to call her and her friend Stephanie, but was unsuccessful. Overcome with worry, the manager went to Tina's house, but knocking on the door yielded no response. Walking around the house, she noticed an open window and climbed inside. She was met with a horrifying sight. The rooms were covered in blood. Terrified, she ran outside and called the police. The arriving officers forced the door open and found blood throughout the house, but there were no bodies. The police noticed traces of motor oil, suggesting that someone had spilled it on the floors. Examining the crime scene, the police put together a preliminary version of events. At the entrance, they found a grocery bag and bloody footprints starting at the door, indicating that one of the residents had entered the house with groceries, only to be ambushed by the perpetrator. The attack seemed to have occurred right after they entered, as evidenced by the amount of blood. The grocery bag helped establish the approximate time of the incident, thanks to a receipt time-stamped at 12 p.m. on November 10th, indicating it happened the previous day. As they continued to search the house, investigators noticed the garage door was partially raised, likely the point of entry. Inside the garage, there were also traces of blood, and Tina's pickup truck was missing. The restaurant manager mentioned that she had tried calling Tina's friend Stephanie, but without success. Living just a few houses down from Tina, Stephanie had also been missing since the previous day, but her relatives had not yet been alarmed. Contacting the school where Sarah and Cody attended, the police learned that the children had been in class on November 10th but did not appear the next day. The abundance of blood in the house indicated that so much blood could not have belonged to just one person, leading to the belief that Tina, her children, and possibly Stephanie, who might have visited her friend, were dead. A bloody shoe print was found on the floor matching the size of Sarah's shoes, which gave hope that the girl might be alive. The footprint leading to the door indicated that someone had exited the house after the incident. A visual analysis of the bloodstains suggested it could belong to different people, and all the traces led to the bathroom, where the murder likely took place. The absence of bodies in Tina's car suggested that the perpetrator might have loaded the bodies into the car and fled. The car was declared missing, and the search for all four continued. Among the possible suspects was Tina's ex-husband, Greg, who stated he was at work 100 kilometers away and spent the night at a friend's house near his workplace, which was confirmed. Sarah and Cody's father also declared his innocence and was worried about the children, having learned about the incident from the police. Continuing to inspect the house, the forensic team noticed cleaning supplies, garbage bags, and a tarp in the garage. At first glance, these items could have been ordinary household items, but nearby, they found bottles of motor oil used to cover the bloodstains in the house. Investigators speculated that these items might have been brought by the perpetrator. There was no receipt on the oil bottles, but there was the name of the Walmart store, the only one in the city. They headed to Walmart, requesting surveillance footage from the previous day, hoping to find the perpetrator and match the purchased items with those found in the house. While they awaited the footage, something interesting happened. The next day, patrol officers found Tina's pickup truck abandoned on the side of the road 10 kilometers from her house. To the detectives' surprise, there wasn't a drop of blood inside the vehicle. which seemed strange considering the amount of blood in the house and the likelihood that the perpetrator transported the bodies in this vehicle. There were no other clues in the truck, and the police hoped for the surveillance footage from Walmart. Reviewing the footage, detectives noticed a man purchasing the same items found in the garage. He appeared completely calm, but the police suspected that he was the perpetrator. Tracking him through street cameras, they saw the man get into a car and drive away. It was not Tina's pickup, but a Toyota Prius. The quality of the footage did not allow them to see the license plate clearly, so investigators turned to the list of all vehicles of that model registered in the county. In the database, they found driver's licenses with photos and soon found a matching person. He was wearing the same shirt as in the Walmart footage. This man was 30-year-old Matthew Hoffman, who had a criminal history including burglaries and arson. He lived near the lake close to Tina's house. Matthew lived in Mount Vernon, a 20-minute drive from Tina's house. Investigators obtained a warrant, and on November 14th, 3 days after the investigation began, a SWAT team stormed his home. They were prepared for anything, but none of them could believe their eyes. The entire house was filled with dry leaves. Leaves were piled half a meter high in each room, and along the walls up to the ceiling were bags stuffed with leaves, even in the bathroom. Matthew was at home and was immediately arrested. When he asked what was going on, one of the officers replied something like, "As if you don't know yourself." After that, Matthew fell silent. The police were stunned as they had never seen anything like it in their lives. Their first thought was that Matthew used the leaves to hide the bodies of his victims. The situation was complicated by the fact that the leaves were wet and clumped together, and the investigators feared that the suspect might have rigged these piles with explosives. They began to carefully probe the leaves with thin sticks, but found nothing. The police searched both floors and then went down to the basement, where they immediately saw another pile of leaves. Shining their flashlights further, they found rags on the leaves, forming something like a bed, on which lay Sarah. The girl was alive and her life was not in danger. Sarah was immediately taken to the hospital for examination and Matthew was taken in for questioning. And despite the fact that the missing girl was found in his basement, the man refused to admit his guilt or reveal the whereabouts of Tina, Stephanie, and Cody. Matthew hardly answered any questions, only saying a few words at the beginning of the interrogation, and then just silently staring at the detectives. At one point, he started making gestures pointing to his heart. When a detective asked, "Are you trying to say that your heart is broken?" Matthew nodded but then fell silent again. Forensic experts continued to meticulously search Hoffman's house, but found neither the missing people nor any clues to their whereabouts. Investigators had to rely on Sarah's testimony, whom they visited in the hospital. The girl recounted that on November 10th, she and her brother Cody came home from school. Upon entering, they immediately noticed blood by the front door. Sarah called out for her mom, but instead, an unknown man ran out of another room. Sarah ran to her bedroom and locked herself in, while Cody headed for the exit, but Sarah didn't see if he managed to get out. She tried to dial 911 but couldn't due to her shaking hands. The man broke down the door and attacked her with a knife, cutting her finger. The girl thought he would kill her, but instead, he cut the cord from a fan and tied her hands, then gagged her and blindfolded her. He carried her to the basement and then to the kitchen. Sarah couldn't see what was happening and had to rely only on her hearing. The perpetrator rummaged through the kitchen for several hours, ran water, and frequently flushed the toilet. When it got dark, he turned on the lights throughout the house and continued walking around. Later, he told Sarah not to resist, carried her to the garage, and put her in her mom's car, covering her with a blanket. He left and returned late at night, got behind the wheel, and drove. After stopping, he told Sarah not to run and left. The girl tried to remove the blindfold, but because of her tied hands, she could only do it partially and recognized the place, a sports complex with baseball fields where her brother practiced. The perpetrator returned, yelled at her, replaced the blindfold, and said he would kill her if she tried to remove it again. He drove away and returned an hour later in another car, transferred Sarah, and drove to another house. There he removed her blindfold, and the girl saw that the bathroom walls were covered with strange drawings of animals and creatures. He left her tied up and left. Sarah did not know what he planned to do with her or what had already happened to her mother and brother, but she feared the worst. The man returned a few hours later, took her out of the bathroom, and Sarah noticed that the house was filled with bags of leaves, and the floors of all the rooms were covered with layers of leaves. She decided to try to talk to him and gain his trust. Sarah asked why he had so many leaves, and he replied that he used them to keep the house warm. The girl asked a few more questions and then asked if he had killed her mother and brother. The perpetrator said no. Sarah did not believe him but was afraid to admit that her loved ones might be dead. She said she was hungry. "Do you want me to cook the eggs in my fridge for you?" he offered to Sarah, but she refused. So he made her cereal even though the milk had already spoiled. The girl hadn't eaten for almost a day, so she had to accept. After that, the man took her to the basement where there was an improvised bed, tied her up, and left her there. She spent several days there. The perpetrator told her that his partner would look after her in his absence, so she shouldn't try to escape. He didn't give her any food, and Sarah began to suffer from hunger. Even under these conditions, she refused to eat the eggs he offered her. One day, the man came down to the basement and assaulted her, leaving the girl in shock and complete exhaustion. She lost track of time and increasingly thought that she wouldn't get out of this place alive. One day, Sarah heard noises and shouts. At first, she was scared that the perpetrator had brought accomplices, but soon the SWAT team burst into the basement and Sarah realized she was saved. The girl stunned the police with her first phrase, "I urgently need to go to school." Later, she explained that she couldn't think clearly at that moment and was afraid of missing too many lessons. After Sarah's rescue and Matthew's arrest, the detectives had one task left: to find Tina, Stephanie, and Cody. Despite Matthew's silence, the interrogation lasted about 9 hours until the prosecutor offered him a deal to avoid the death penalty in exchange for a confession. Matthew agreed, but asked to stage an escape attempt so that he would be killed. The authorities refused, and the search continued. News of Sarah's rescue drew the attention of local residents, and the number of volunteers in the search grew to 400 people. But the search yielded no results. 2 days later, Matthew's lawyer reported that his client was ready to confess. Matthew wrote a letter in which he admitted that he initially planned a robbery, but everything went wrong. He stopped the car a few kilometers from Sarah's house, set up a sleeping bag in the forest, and started watching. In the morning, when the house was empty, he broke in through the broken garage door. Tina, who returned home, became his first victim, and then he killed Stephanie, who came into the house. He moved the bodies to the bathroom and dismembered them. Then he began preparing the house for arson, hoping to destroy the evidence. When Sarah and Cody returned home, he killed Cody and grabbed Sarah. He decided to keep her alive and took her to his house, continuing to think about what to do next. Buying the necessary supplies, he hid the bodies in a remote park. Returning to Tina's house, he encountered problems with the car and abandoned the arson plan. Instead, he left the car and walked back to his own. He did not go out anymore that day, planning to set the house on fire later. The next morning, Matthew was ready to carry out his sinister plan. He went to the parking lot where he had left Tina's car earlier. But just as he managed to get into it, a police car drove by. At that moment, the blood in Tina's house had not yet been discovered, but the patrolman was aware of the request to check her disappearance. Moreover, his colleague had seen a similar pickup truck near Tina's house yesterday. The patrolman became suspicious and noticed a second car nearby, a light-colored Toyota with a man behind the wheel. Approaching him, he asked for his documents and inquired what he was doing there. The man, who introduced himself as Matthew, said he was waiting for his girlfriend, Sarah. The policeman didn't notice anything suspicious in his behavior and left, not suspecting that in a few hours, he would face this man's horrifying crimes. After the encounter with the policeman, Matthew returned home, burned some evidence in the backyard, slept for a few hours, and around midnight, prepared to go back to Sarah's house. He left some of his belongings in the forest opposite, fearing the police might find them. But by that time, the house was already cordoned off, and on the spot, dozens of police officers were present. Matthew realized that setting the house on fire was no longer an option, nor could he quietly retrieve his belongings from the forest. He watched the police, hiding among the trees, then decided to head back home. Since then, he hardly ever left his dwelling, where he had assaulted Sarah. Eventually, the police tracked him down and rescued the girl. The detectives realized that Tina, Stephanie, and Cody had been dead the entire time. In his written confession, Matthew finally disclosed the location where he had hidden the bags with their remains. Matthew explained that he used his gear to climb a large tree in a remote part of the park. The trunk of this tree was hollow, providing enough space for the bags. Officers went to the specified location and found the remains inside the tree, cutting an opening in the trunk. Following this discovery, Matthew was charged with triple murder, and he did not